We've all had the feeling when we're trying to create a design and it's not quite coming out how we want it to. Now there's a few things you can do to try and combat this, and one of them is making sure that everything is well structured within a grid setup. So I'm going to walk you through my recent poster design that optimizes this and talk you through how grids work and why they work and how to use them. So let's jump in. So guys, this is the final design. Now you can see it's a very simple layout. It's mainly just a large title, a small bit of text and some images. The thing that makes it work as a full design is the grid lines, because it's all structured, it's all kind of in place, and it makes it aesthetic. So let me just jump into a new canvas. I can show you here when I open the new margins. You can see this is all somewhat lined up. You know, I've got a clear grid line setup going on. We can start working through how I decipher where I'm going to place what where. So file new, 3840 by 4800, 300 resolution, hit create on that. Now to start with, you need to put the grid lines in. So we're going to come up to view, guides, and new guide layout. Now this is going to be the main window where you can decide your grids. So you're going to be able to put in columns, rows, and margins here. Now there is also a section for presets. So you can see here what you could create is something how I've done here. I could then come down to, come up to preset, go on save preset. And now all I need to do is just save this as a file so that then when I next come into my presets tab, I can just load this one up and I already have it made. So this is really useful. So what I've decided to do for this poster design is 6 columns, 10 rows. I try and keep the gutter on the columns and rows the same. So I also normally match this to the margin unless I'm doing a bit of a bigger margin. So for example, I think my standard would be this 100 pixel margin on everything and 100 pixel gutter to match it. Now this is really good because if you have columns, let's say I'm putting in some images down here, the gap between the margin and the next column is going to be the same. So aesthetically, it's very balanced. But for this one, I'm going to do a slightly increased margin so that I've got a bit of a bigger space around the outside, and then keep the columns and rows where they are and press OK. So now I need to decipher how I'm going to place it into the document. So usually the route I take with this is deciding what is the primary element. For me here, it's the title. It's the biggest aspect of the poster. And then from there, I can work in the images around it. So what I'm going to do, so the title is look up at the art. I wanted it slightly off axis. So, you know, I didn't want it just center aligned down the middle like this. So what I'm going to do is maybe come 1 or 2 columns to the left, drag in a text box, and then we can type it in. Now I'm using a text box here because it's just going to be a little bit easier to kind of keep it within the range I want it. So for example, I've put the bottom of my text box here because that's where I want it to cut off. So now I can increase the size and then bring in the leading. Now I can keep kind of just balancing these to get to a point that I like. So I think that size might be a bit too big. So let's go to like 190 and drag that down until it reaches. So yeah, about there is good. Now I'm going to make sure that this is also set to optical, which it is, and then do maybe -40 on the kerning, and then just make some small adjustments using the option and arrow keys just to try and make it look balanced. Now I won't spend too much time on this just for the sake of the video, but that's pretty good. So now with our title in place, we can work in the images. So let's jump into our first image. I'm going to drag in all the images I'm going to use for this. Now I will usually compile the images before I start. I won't start with one image in a title and then kind of find something else to add in. I'll just get everything I want to use and then work them in one by one. So now the initial image I found was this one. Now I thought this was really cool and I played around with a few layouts of this, but I thought composition wise, because of this upwards angle, I thought it would look quite good in the bottom right corner, or in a bottom corner, I mean. So what I'm going to do here is edit, transform, and rotate this, and I'll hide this one and make sure that this image is under the title. So now in terms of contrast, you can see if the further I drag it up, obviously I wanted the text black and white, just like a traditional monochromatic poster design, but that is nearly impossible to read. So I was working this down and down and down because I was very set on where I wanted the headline to be. So I'm just kind of playing around with placement and scale. And I thought, okay, if I'm going to have it in this corner, this kind of overarching building element looks a little bit weird by itself. So I kind of want that out of the frame. So I'm going to crop that out. And now this is where the grid lines can come in and you can kind of shape your edges. So remember, Command: is how you open and close your grid lines. So I'm going to drag it left enough to the point where that little edge frame is out of the way. And now I think a lot of people are under the impression that when you're using grids, you need to perfectly align it with the columns and the rows. They're there as a guideline, not as like a strict conformity that you need to obey. You can just play around with it how you want. It's there to help you rather than to keep you within a box. So for example here, I align it with the top of the row, but I'm not going to align it with the side of the column because that's just going too strict and that doesn't work for me here. Now if I go too far this way, too much of it is out of the frame. So in terms of columns, this just doesn't work with aligning. So this is when I can just hold shift, move it along the row line and kind of get it to a placement where I want it to be and then go from there. Now I might make it slightly bigger just so that this kind of diagonal angle here is away from the bottom of the text. So say about there. Once again, just move left and right, see what you can do. Might drag it down to this grid line, and I think about there is good for me on composition. So now without actually knowing where the previous one is, if I check now, yeah, it's very similar because I've followed the same kind of rule set. So that one is just on one column slightly up and then probably slightly more to the left. There you go. But you're going to see there's going to be weird moments like this where, for example, this edge of the text is going to slightly misalign with this. Now, I think, at least me, in my opinion, I'd want to align it just for the sake of keeping everything really structured. But I think often that doesn't work too well. Like if you're trying to be a perfectionist, it can end up being a bit weird. So you have to kind of let go of that a little bit. So I'm just going to keep this where it is and we're going to settle there for the moment. Okay, so now with this kind of layout defining image we have in here that's kind of structuring our text within this blank space because of the angle, we can now think about the second image. So now the way that I'm going to decide what image I place where next is based on what I want the viewer to see. So if I bring in our remaining 4 images here, looking at them side by side, I'm trying to decide what I think is either the most intricate or suitable for this subject. And for me, I think that this structure here is the most visually interesting one, which is what I want the viewer to see next. So now there's a few ways to decide that. You either decide that on placement. So for example, your eye reads from left to right and top to bottom. So if you start with this one up here, and then I want, let's say, this one to be second, this one to be third, this one to be fourth, your eyes are naturally going to take this kind of route. So now you can decide it in that way, or you can use the other principles like scale. So if I'm going to shrink this down, and shrink that down even more, your eye will then kind of trace it in an order where I believe naturally you're going to look at this one, then this, then this, then this. And your eye's going to kind of read it normally how it would read text. So now you need to decide, let's say if this is the scale you wanted to use, you then decide placement so that you can order the eye of the viewer to look at it how you want it to. So with my second image being decided, I can now look at placement of where I want it. So let me move this up slightly, and now I am just going to use these grid lines as a guide, right? So I'm going to create it to 2 columns width, maybe even shrink it a little bit more. So now instead of just going to the next column to make it really small, I can just go up with a row, and then come down and then drag it across. It doesn't need to perfectly align with these columns, but you can just kind of move it around how you want using the columns and the rows. You don't have to be defined to one of them. Now, I quite like this overlaid aspect where it's kind of layering over the text because I think it's quite symbolic of what I'm actually trying to produce here. It's saying that, if you're walking around a city and you look up, all the buildings, they are art in themselves. You shouldn't be prioritizing reading through the text. It's kind of like, the image is literally already here, so let me drag it over the text and then read that instead, So play around with placement, use the columns and the rows. Don't just confine yourself to one. So now for me, if I drag it kind of up to this column and now down to this one, so I'm going to make this probably about 3 columns in height or 3 rows in height, overlaying the K, but I think the actual form of the K is still easily readable. You can still work out that it says look. So now should be around there. Maybe drag this down slightly. There we go. So now I'm happy with the placement of this. Now we can move on to our second image, which I want to be this one. And now in terms of where I'm actually placing them in general on the canvas, a lot of this is based on contrast and blank space. So you still want white space, enough to kind of let the actual assets in the poster breathe. So now we've got all of this space here. So let me try and get a smaller asset in this area. Now I'd quite like to line it up with the bottom of the T here, or maybe 1 column below. So now shrink down to a column height, drag it across. I think already I quite like the placement. Let's reveal another image. This one I think could be a nice overlay or behind that eagle image. And now how you overlay images is also based on contrast. So right here, because this sky is going to be quite dark, that's going to take some detail away from this structure here. So I might drag this one below and decide that you can still see a lot of interesting elements on this one if it's below. Play around with the placement, maybe drag it over that way slightly, shrink down to a column height. There you go. Now we've got one more image. So now from this, we could create a similar route. So I could overlay it perhaps over this image, maybe bring it up to this kind of column height here, or I could repeat the same kind of process, maybe just over this direction. You really just want to kind of take the grid lines and play around, just see where you can put your images and just see where it works. I think this kind of diagonal line leads really well up into this image. So I think that placement there works quite well. I might shift it across slightly so that this kind of edge of this beam just here lines up with the side of the building. See, there we go. You see how this is deliberately out of the grid lines now, but it works in composition. So you have to step away from being a perfectionist to kind of make it look optically pleasing. So now with all of my images placed down, I can work in the text because I see text as, now this is the sub element. So you've got text, as in title, images, subtext. So in terms of hierarchy and priority, that's how I'm going to order it. That's how I'm going to place it on the canvas. That's how I'm going to structure it around. So now I just wanted a simple kind of subheading and then body text. So I'm going to create a text box within the margins just to start with and just paste in this title here, which is going to be Brutal Beauty as a subtitle. And then I'm going to create another text box and paste in my body text. So now from this point, I can either shimmy the images to try and get it in a layout I want. You can see on the original here, I've gone for a different layout and I've got one additional image in here that I haven't included, as in I've got one additional image in this one. So let me figure out now where I would place this text instead. So I think here is going to be quite tight. You know, it's quite cramped within the other two images either side of it. So, you know, I could either kind of disregard the grid lines and shift them across a little bit, but I think it still looks slightly tight. Like, it's okay, it's not really where I want it to be. So now, let me just play around with this, you know, perhaps line it up with the top of the E. So drag it up here, use my arrow keys to kind of perfectly align it, drag it across to the margin line. You know, I quite like that placement, but it feels really heavy in this area. So let's say if I bring it back, I could then, if I need to or wanted to change around the images, I could play around with that. Maybe line that up at the bottom of the art, drag this one across, or drag this up to kind of repeat that same effect we had earlier. And now I could take this subtitle and body text, drag it down. Now I think that's too low, you see? I think the gap between the margin and the rest of the piece is too low, like whereas up here, it's still quite a prominent feature. So now I could drag this one, line it up with the margin, take this one over and then flip it. So we have the same effect, but we're creating more space for the body text to go. And there we go. I quite like this composition as well. And I think just from playing around with the images and even perhaps, for example, I've just flipped them both horizontally. And I think we've got the same kind of layout and layering and it works well, except we've created a lot of space for this subtitle to go in. And that works a lot better visually. I'm just going to add in my logo here. And now once I've set this to black, then let me think about placement. So once again, get the grid lines up, kind of use these as a rough starting point. So bottom right corner could work. There's a nice clear bit of open space. And if you zoom out and you look at this on a larger scale, your eye kind of goes top left to bottom right. In the kind of diagonal framing of these images as well, you've got this one here into that one, this one here into that one. It kind of takes your eye. Everything's angled diagonally. So you either end with the logo or perhaps put it in the top left corner and start with the logo. Now I quite like this. I think it fills it up very well. So I could either keep it directly in the top left, maybe go down a row for a little bit of difference, perhaps where the contrast is laid. So you can see the top of this image lines up with the grid lines. So maybe I'll move it to line up with that. You know, just play around, see if you can create some structure based off what you already have there. Now I quite like this here as well. So I'm actually going to keep it here for the moment. Now taking a broader look at this poster now that everything's in place, I feel that it might be too heavy. You know, it might be too dense and have too much info packed into it. So for example, looking at this original, you see that I've got 3 smaller images and the one large one. And I think that this gives a lot of space to breathe so you can see each asset individually rather than one kind of blur. So I think at this point in your work is when you can look at your layout and your selections and what you've created, and you can decide whether there's things that you don't need or that you need to keep in or add stuff. But here, I think it's quite dense and it's really filled up and it's kind of a little bit odd in terms of contrast and placement. So for example here, let me see if I can remove an image. And I think this in a really small scale works interestingly with the other image. But for example, for this one, if I hide this, drag this over to the side to kind of replace it, now I can shape this within the grid lines here. Now for me, as I zoom out, it feels a lot lighter. It feels like, you know, you still have intricate details and you've got the small images, but there's a lot more focus. I think this gives a lot more room for the assets to breathe. So I'm going to stick with this as a layout, and now let's move on to texturing. So I've just added a simple black and white filter just to level out all the images and make them all the same monochromatic colors. So now what I'm going to do is create a new layer combining all of my current layers. So with all of my layers visible, I'm going to do Command, Option, Shift, and E. If you're on Windows, it's going to be Control, Alt, Shift, and E, I believe. I'm just going to rename this filter and convert it to a smart object. So now we're going to use the filter gallery just to kind of create this uniform texture, just as a subtle kind of touch to finalize it as a design. So now come on to filter and filter gallery. So for the first one, I'm going to close my folders. Let me come to texture and texturizer. Now I'm going to set the texture to canvas, but you can play around with this and kind of opt for what works best with your work. So because I'm kind of looking for a paper look, I'm going to do canvas. It's going to try and give it that analog look of printed paper. So now I'll play around with the scaling. I've kept it quite low just to make the detail really fine. So I'm actually going to drag that down even more. Let's go for around 50 on scaling, maybe slightly up. Let's go for 60. And now set the relief higher or lower based on what you want. So for example, if I raise the relief, it's going to be considerably more textured. So I'm going to drop that down. Let's say 4 or 5. Let's go for 5. Now you can either change the lighting angle if you want to, but I'm going to keep it on top. So now as I press OK, as I zoom in, we've got this nice textured overlay applying kind of evenly to every asset in the poster. So it's a nice uniform texture to use. And then from here, we can introduce overlay texture layers just to kind of top it off. So I'm going to drag in a paper texture from Design Syndrome. And this is a PNG paper texture, so it's really easy to use. You simply can just adjust the opacity. So I'm going to drop it down to maybe 30. Now this, once again, is just going to be a bit more of a uniform look. Let me just increase this just so I can show you the difference. So if I set it to 40 here, you can see this detail coming out in the darker colors, in the blacks, and it kind of levels out the darks and the lights overall. So you've got a nice even balance of texture. And now as a final one, I'm going to come into solid color, set the hex code as 808080, right click this, convert to smart object, filter, camera raw filter. Now this is when we're adding a noise layer. Okay, so this is the best way to add noise. Come down to effects on the right hand side, drag that grain up, keep the size quite low for a finer look, maybe roughness around 40. And now from here, set this layer mode to overlay. And now you've got a even grain going across every color in the image, and it brings out some nice fine detail. Now, a really good tip for you is if you're consistently using this grain effect and the method to actually go into the camera raw filter and do it, what you should do is come out to Window and Actions, open your Actions tab, press this record button down here, and then repeat the exact same steps to create the layer. So now, for example, if I get rid of my layer, I've created a pattern recording here. So if I come into this and press play, it's going to create a noise layer for me. You record the actions of how you create it, and then you can just play it just to save you loads of time in steps. So now I've already got an active noise overlay here just from my actions. Now from this point, it's just adjusting lighting and contrast here. So I'm going to come down to adjustments and add a curves layer. I'm going to slightly reduce the dark ends so that we've got a bit more contrast between the lights and the highs. And then in the center bit, try and drag it up slightly so that we've got a bit more gray color coming in. So let me just drag that up a little bit, play around with this balance. I actually quite like it if I increase the dark values, maybe drop the midtones. So I'm going to say in terms of contrast, happy with it about there. There we go, that's nice. And there we go, that is our final brutalist poster design, just using strict layout and a clear grid to kind of structure everything you want within it. So I hope this helps. Now, as always, I appreciate you making it to the end of the video, and I hope that you can learn something and that you can add something to your own design process for your work. Now, if you want to watch another video of mine, there's going to be one just here that you think you need to see. So go ahead and watch that, and I'll see you over there.